Good evening. Tonight, Norwalk Public Library welcomes ArtScapades, the Northern Renaissance, from the big picture to minute details. ArtScapades will look at how the Northern Renaissance artists revolutionized paintings and had a profound influence on artistic practice across Europe. This lecture looks at the lives and works of Jean van Eyck, Hieronymus Bosch, Hans Holbein the Younger, and Peter Bruegel the Elder. Robin Hoffman and Jody Steifelman of ArtScapades began teaching art appreciation in 1998. They presented at libraries, art centers, and museums in Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, and Florida. So tonight, Jody will be our presenter.
Thanks, Cindy. Let me just minimize me. I want to thank Cindy and the Norwalk Public Library for inviting us back on. And as you saw, my partner Robin was on with us to start. I don't know how long she's staying on, but just so you know, Robin and I put these lectures together and we take turns presenting them to you. So tonight you get me for the Northern Renaissance. If you were with us in March over the Zoom, it was during Women's History Month, and we looked at Baroque and Renaissance women artists. And tonight we're going to continue in the Renaissance with a look at 4 Northern Renaissance artists. And with the success of the Broadway musical 6, which many of you may have seen or you may have heard about, we've included an artist who is known for his portraits of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. So a little background to get us started. The Renaissance, which began in Italy, moved to the north of Europe, but it was different there. The Renaissance in the north was not a rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman culture the way it had been in Italy. While Italian Renaissance artists were likely to consider scientific principles behind composition like proportion, anatomy, and perspective, Northern Renaissance artists were more concerned with what their art looked like. Color was of key importance, and the more detail a Northern artist could cram into a piece, the happier he was. The Marode altarpiece is one of the great masterpieces of Northern Renaissance art. It is a triptych composed in 3 hinged panels. A new middle class of bankers and merchants were commissioning these works. To please their patrons, artists included these patrons in their works, and we see the couple who commissioned this painting in the left panel. A particularly Northern aspect of this painting are the many details which are rich with symbolic meaning. The central panel focuses on Mary, who is absorbed in her reading. The angel Gabriel comes to her, and she's announcing that she will be the mother of the Christ child. Symbols of her purity include the vase of white lilies, the open biblical text, and the white linen. Close inspection also reveals an image of Christ on the cross, floating from the direction of those circular windows, and they're coming to impregnate Mary. The panel on the far right depicts St. Joseph shown in his carpenter's shop. The tools that he is working with are a symbol of the Passion of Christ. In the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, led by the German monk Martin Luther, put an abrupt end to the relative unity that had existed for the previous 1,000 years under the Roman Catholic Church. The ideas behind the Protestant Reformation were simple. The church should be reformed so that it was less greedy, fairer, and accessible to all people, not just to the rich and well-educated. The Reformation had a huge impact on Northern European art. One of the major changes was that religious imagery was no longer the major feature in art. Many churches were no longer commissioning religious art for display because it was believed that religious imagery was distracting and could lead to idol worship. Luther argued that the Bible was produced in Latin, a language most people couldn't read. This print shows Luther burning the papal bull of excommunication with vignettes from his life. The beginnings of oil painting are recorded as early as the 12th century in Northern Europe, but it was the expert handling of oil by early Netherlandish painters in the 15th century that represented a turning point in its adoption as the major painting medium in Europe in the 16th century. Oil paints allowed artists to depict the world with unprecedented precision. By 1540, the previous method, tempera, had become all but extinct. 15th century Dutch artists were the first to make oil standard painting medium. They perfected the use of layers and glazes. Artists in the rest of Northern Europe then followed their lead, and finally, Italian artists adopted oil as well. Early works were still painted on wood, but around the end of the 15th century, canvas became more popular as it was cheaper, easier to transport, and allowed for larger works. So with this background in mind, let's look at our first artist. Jan van Eyck is the most famous member of a family of Flemish painters, and his work brought an unprecedented realism to the themes and figures of Northern Renaissance art. Neither the date nor place of Van Eyck's birth is definitively documented. He is believed to have been born around 1390 and was identified as having been born in Meysik in Liège in Belgium. And this claim is considered credible considering his surname translates to as of Eyck. The man with the red turban is said to be a self-portrait. Now, Van Eyck's motto, one of the first and still most distinctive signatures in art, is Als ik kan, or as I can, and it first appeared on the frame of this painting as indicative of his emerging self-confidence. As on other Van Eyck frames, the letters are painted to appear carved. And typically for Van Eyck, the head is a little large in relation to the torso. And we can see it again 2 years later with this relatively large head in relation to the torso in this portrait. From surviving documents, we know that this formal portrait was commissioned. We're looking at a contemporary Flemish statesman who was an ambassador for Philip the Good at the court of Henry V of England and has a gold ring on his little finger. Typical of Van Eyck's early portraits, the sitter is shown holding an emblem that displays his profession and class. Little is known of Van Eyck's early life and works. He is often thought to be the anonymous artist known as Hand G of the Turin Milan Hours. If this is correct, the Turin illustrations are the only known works from his early period. Unfortunately, most of these miniatures were destroyed by fire in 1904 and survive only in photographs and copies. While we are not sure whether he was Hand G, we do know that he worked at two courts. First, for John of Bavaria, also known as John the Pitiless, for 2 years beginning in 1422, and after his death secured a prestigious appointment with Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. Van Eyck traveled with a group to Lisbon to prepare for the Duke's wedding to Isabella of Portugal. His task was to paint the bride so that the Duke would be able to form a picture of Isabella before the marriage. While the portrait is lost, we know what it looked like from copies such as the one shown here. The princess was probably not particularly attractive, and that is exactly how Van Eyck showed her. He showed his sitters as dignified, but did not hide their imperfections. As court painter, Van Eyck was very well paid, making him an exceptional figure among early Netherlandish painters, since most of them depended on individual commissions for their livelihoods. These two small painted panels, or diptych, are among the earliest surviving works by Van Eyck and were most likely commissioned for private devotion. They are renowned for their unusual complexity and technical skill. On the left, the crucifixion shows Christ's followers grieving in the foreground, soldiers and spectators milling about in the middle ground, and 3 crucified bodies in the upper ground. This scene is framed against a blue sky with a view of Jerusalem in the distance. The right panel shows scenes associated with the Last Judgment. We are looking at a vision of hell at the bottom. In the center, Van Eyck shows the resurrected awaiting judgment, and at the top, we see Christ flanked by saints, apostles, clergy, virgins, and nobility. Over the following decade, Van Eyck's reputation and technical ability grew. mostly from his innovative approaches towards the handling of oil paint. His revolutionary approach to oil was such that a myth arose that he had invented oil painting. Van Eyck was one of the first to widely test the possibilities of oil painting, for example, by not letting one layer dry before applying the next. Van Eyck produced paintings for private clients in addition to his work at the court. Foremost among these is the Ghent altarpiece painted for Jodocus Veit and his wife, shown here in panels that can be seen when the work is in its closed position. The work is a oh gosh, I can't say this word again. Polyptych consisting of 20 panels. More famous is the view when the work is open. The Ghent altarpiece is also known as the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb after the lower middle panel, where a lamb is worshipped by groups of angels, martyrs, prophets, and apostles. On the frame is an incomplete inscription in Latin that identifies the artists of the work as Hubert and Jan van Eyck. The usual interpretation is that Hubert van Eyck was the brother of Jan and that he was the painter who began the altarpiece, which Jan then completed. As part of an emergency conservation of the Ghent altarpiece that took place recently, the work has for the first time been photographed centimeter by centimeter at extremely high resolution. The results are now available to the public on an interactive website that allows viewers to zoom in close enough to see tiny details like the blood pouring out of the lamb. And just to give you an idea of the actual size of the Ghent altarpiece, here is how it stands under a new glass case at the St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent. Following the successful conservation treatment of the Ghent altarpiece, this work, and we're looking at it before, was recently restored by the Louvre and is the centerpiece of their current show on Van Eyck, which runs through June 17th if anyone is imminently heading to Paris. The removal of layers of oxidized varnish that had darkened this painting over time and the restoration of its exquisite colors and dazzling, long obscured light allow us to see it once again in its original glory. This work depicts the Virgin Mary crowned by a hovering angel while she presents the infant Jesus to Nicholas Rollin, who was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Burgundy, who commissioned this work for his parish church, Notre Dame de Chastille, in Autun. The work remained in the church until it was destroyed by fire in 1793 during the French Revolution. In 1805, this work entered the collection of the Louvre. Well, the scene is set within a loggia decorated with columns. The three arches in the middle background represent the Holy Trinity, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Jesus is holding a globe with a gold cross that symbolizes Christ's earthly power and his spiritual force, while the crystal symbolizes Mary's virginity. And this is something we couldn't have seen this clearly before the restoration. In 1432, Van Eyck, now in his early 40s, married the much younger Margaretha, who was then in her mid-20s. Soon after their marriage, they moved to a home in Bruges where they would go on to have 2 children. And Van Eyck's portrait of Margaretha is one of the earliest European artworks to depict a painter's spouse. It was completed when she was around 33. The years between 1434 and 1436 are generally considered the high point of Van Eyck's career. And this work is a portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, a member of a merchant family from Lucca living in Bruges. It is not intended as a record of their wedding, and contrary to popular thought, his wife is not pregnant, but is holding up her full-skirted dress in their contemporary fashion. Van Eyck was intensely interested in the effects of light. Oil paint allowed him to depict it with great subtlety, and most notably, we can see it on the gleaming brass chandelier. Despite his legendary objectivity, Van Eyck's paintings are perhaps most remarkable for their pure fictions. He frequently aimed to deceive the eye and amaze the viewer with his sheer artistry. Van Eyck's painted mirrors reflect unseen, imaginary events occurring outside the picture space. The mirror on the real wall reflects 2 tiny figures entering the room. One of them is probably Van Eyck himself, as suggested by his prominent signature above, which reads, Jan van Eyck has been here, 1434. The similarity to modern graffiti is not accidental. Van Eyck often signed his paintings in a witty way. Another commissioned work, this altarpiece is widely considered one of Van Eyck's most ambitious works and has been described as a masterpiece of masterpieces. The man who commissioned it, Joris van der Pijl, is shown surrounded by saints. The Virgin Mary is shown at the center with the Christ child on her lap. Van der Pijl in white is dressed with the finery of medieval canon and is being presented to Mary by Saint George. Saint Donation stands to the left. The panel is noted for the fine depiction of clothing, including furs, silks, and brocades, and for the elaborate and detailed religious images. This is one of the last works by Van Eyck. It is known as the Lucca Madonna, as it once belonged to the Duke of the Italian city of Lucca. The painting portrays the Virgin with 4 small lion statues, a reference to the throne of Solomon. Mary sits on a throne and you can see the infant at her breast. It is an intimate scene. The diagonal lines of the walls and the carpet provide linear perspective, which leads our eye right to the center. Jan van Eyck died in Bruges in 1441 and was buried in the Church of Saint Donation, which was later destroyed during the French Revolution. He was survived by his wife Margaretha and is said that she was the model for Mary in this work. Less than 30 works by Van Eyck survive, mostly religious images and portraits. Van Eyck brought an unprecedented realism to the themes and figures of Renaissance art. So our second artist is a radical departure from Van Eyck. He is known for having challenged the existing boundaries of classical art. Hieronymus Bosch was born around 1450 in the Netherlands near the Belgian border. He was the 4th of 5 children in a family of painters, and it is assumed that his father or one of his uncles taught him to paint, but none of their works survive. Almost all of the information we have about Bosch comes from the official records of his hometown. Bosch was an Orthodox Catholic and prominent member of a local religious brotherhood, but his most characteristic paintings are so bizarre that in the 17th century, he was reputed to have been a heretic. The exact number of Bosch's surviving works has been a subject of considerable debate. He signed only 7 of his paintings, and there is uncertainty whether all the paintings once ascribed to him were actually done by him. His style was highly influential and was widely imitated by his numerous followers. And today, only about 25 paintings are definitively attributed to Bosch. His works are not dated, so no accurate chronology can be made. So we will look at his works partly in chronological order, but where that is not possible, we're going to group them according to style. So this is thought to be among Bosch's earliest signs works. It shows the 3 Magi worshiping the Christ child on his mother's lap, while Joseph looks on. The stage-like setting with a curtain held up by angels may be an indication of the influence of mystery plays. It's documented that mystery plays were performed in his hometown during Bosch's lifetime, including one which featured the arrival of 3 magi. The emptiness of the space is somewhat unusual for Bosch, as he is better known for, and you're going to see it, for very full and detailed scenes. Bosch has carefully planned a tunnel view into this landscape to show perspective. And in this later version of the same subject by Bosch, we can see less empty space with the characters filling the scene. And this painting takes its title from the Latin words ecce homo, meaning behold the man. These were the words spoken by Pontius Pilate as Jesus was paraded before an angry mob in Jerusalem before being sentenced to the cross. We see Jesus with his hands in shackles, wearing a crown of thorns as he is mocked and jeered. The dialogue between Pilate and the mob is indicated by 3 Gothic inscriptions placed near the mouths of the protagonists. These function in a similar manner to speech balloons used in modern comic strips. To Pilate's cry of ecce homo, The mob replies, "Crucify him." A third inscription, "Save us, Christ Redeemer," can be seen in the lower left of the canvas. It appears these words were coming from the mouths of two donors, which look like they had been painted over. Typical of Bosch, this painting is full of symbolic imagery. Most notable are the two animals traditionally seen as emblems of evil in Christian iconography, the owl in the niche above Pilate and the giant toad sprawled on the back of a shield carried by one of the soldiers. Bosch's work has a surrealistic, cartoon-like quality and expresses the moral failings of the human condition. Here, Bosch depicts how people are fooled by lack of alertness and insight. On the right, the conjurer displays his sleight of hand with a game of cup and balls. On the left, an onlooker bends over the table, and while the crowd is distracted watching the show, the conjurer's assistant is busy removing the victim's purse. The use of animals supports the messages of the painting. The owl from the basket at the conjurer's waist signifies his intelligence. Frogs jumping out of the mouth of the central character represent the extent to which the victim let go of reason and gave in to animalistic impulses. From an element art perspective, you can see how Bosch has used the color red to balance this painting and move our eye across the work. Bosch lived just before the Protestant Reformation at a time when there was widespread discontent with the Roman Catholic clergy. Having lost respect for these leaders, people led hedonistic and greedy behavior. In an effort to control the population, Catholic inquisitions condemned citizens as witches, wizards, and heretics. Hangings, beheadings, and burnings at the stake became everyday public sights. Art communicated moral messages, and here Bosch depicts humanity's vulnerability to the temptation of evil. Painted on a wooden tabletop rather than a canvas or panel, Bosch's composition is meant to be seen from all sides, and we are meant to look down at it. The center circle set up like a roulette wheel shows the 7 deadly sins: lust, greed, gluttony, envy, sloth, pride, and wrath. In the middle of the circle of sins is Christ rising out of a sarcophagus to judge the quick and the dead. In the 4 corners, Bosch shows the consequences of refraining from or submitting to these sins. Clockwise from top left, we see a dying man's confession, the last judgment, and heaven and hell. There is something else that Bosch intended to portray, but it is a bit obscure. When you view it without focusing on individual painted scenes, you will see that it is in the form of a great eye staring up at you. It is the viewer that Bosch is addressing with this work. You are the subject of Christ's stare as he watches your every move should you fall into sin. The center of the eye bears the chilling Latin inscription, "Beware, beware, God is watching you." This Bosch work was originally a triptych. The middle panel, however, is lost. Only the 2 side panels remain, which are displayed as 3 different works of art in 3 different museums. This work is a statement on the 7 deadly sins. Starting at the right, death and the miser symbolizes avarice. A dying man seems torn between salvation and his own greed. At the foot of the bed is a younger man, possibly the miser at an earlier age, hypocritically throwing coins into a chest with one hand as he fingers a rosary with the other. In his last hour, with death literally at the door, the miser still hesitates. Will he reach for the demon's bag of gold, or will he follow the angel's gesture and direct his final thoughts to the crucifix in the window? The left panel has been split into 2 works. The top portion is the Ship of Fools, and here a group of 10 people are gathered in a boat. I think I've got the right people, sorry. The main group is comprised of a Franciscan friar and a nun playing a lute. Their mouths are wide open as if singing, but they appear in fact to be trying to bite a pancake hanging from the mast. A roasted goose is also strapped up above on that same mast. And the bottom portion of the left panel, entitled "The Allegory of Intemperance," can be seen locally at the Yale Art Gallery. Gluttony is personified by the swimmers at the upper left who have been gathered around a large wine barrel straddled by a pot-bellied peasant. Another man swims closer to shore, his vision obscured by the meat pie balanced on his head. And on the right is a pair of lovers in a tent. That gluttony and drunkenness led to lust was a lesson that the moralizers never tired of driving home to their audiences. And the lost, I'm sorry, I'm one circle behind. And the lost center panel of this triptych undoubtedly included the 5 remaining sins. So let's turn now to Bosch's more well-known middle period, where we find his great panoramic triptychs. And here, with the exterior panels closed, we see God creating the earth. A tiny figure of God can be found in the upper left with a Bible in his lap. When opened, gone are the shades of gray, and we see his most famous triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights. Shown with a riot of color, the open triptych is kind of like entering Oz. In the panel on the left, Bosch has placed God with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and this is the beginning of the narrative that contains the basic religious message of the times, warning of the dangers that await anyone who strays from the path of righteousness. The center panel depicts a strange mixture of weird animals and organic shapes set in a lush garden. The assorted people are engaged in various acts of carefree enjoyment as they ride naked on horseback or bathe in the lakes and pools within the garden. And some critics believe that Bosch painted a self-portrait of himself and possibly his wife in the center panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights. So sometime around 1480, Bosch married a woman, Alette van den Merven, who was a few years older than he was, and the couple moved into a house that his wife had inherited from her wealthy family. They had no children, and it seemed that they lived a comfortable life. The joy of the center panel gives way to a dark vision of the punishments of hell in the right panel. Swords and daggers slice into the victims, and strange animal-like creatures now feast on human flesh. So taking Bosch's painting into the present, and we love to find these things and share them with you. You've probably heard of Doc Martens, the trendy shoe and boot company, which targets the young set, now puts images of this painting on some of their products. And one reviewer on their website said to, quote, expect lots of compliments wearing these boots. And if you're not done shopping yet and want the total look, we found this sweater and these leggings available too. Bosch was famous for painting triptychs, and though we won't go into detail on others, you may recognize some of these 4 if your travels have taken you to Madrid, Venice, Lisbon, or Vienna. Before Bosch, triptychs had been meant for altarpieces and always contained religious themes. Bosch was the first who also included scenes of everyday life. Bosch's late works are fundamentally different from his triptychs. The scale changes radically, and instead of meadows or hellish landscapes inhabited by hundreds of tiny beings, he painted densely compacted groups of half-length figures pressed tight against the picture plane. Well, this work depicts Jesus carrying the cross above a dark background surrounded by numerous heads, most of which are characterized with very grotesque faces. There are a total of 18 portraits plus the one of Saint Veronica's veil. Bosch's painting emphasizes the contrast between the brutality of the tormentors and the mild suffering Christ. And note how Bosch uses the diagonal line of the cross to focus our eye on Christ, who is also in the middle of the painting. Despite all of the action taking place, this diagonal line of the cross draws us directly to Christ. The most peaceful and untroubled of Bosch's mature works depict various saints in contemplation or repose. While the landscape is similar to those in his triptychs, this work is not crowded with figures. Dressed in a white garment, our eye is drawn directly to Saint Jerome. Bosch died in 1516 at around the age of 65. He may have succumbed to one of the epidemics of the time, but there is no definitive record. The records do show that a funeral mass in his memory was held in the Church of St. John on August 9th of this same year. Bosch was famous during his lifetime. A generation after his death, his paintings were avidly collected by Philip II of Spain, so many of his works are in the Prado in Madrid. While other artists in the 1500s were trying to depict the world realistically, Bosch was painting the imaginary, the grotesque, and yes, the horrific. His manner had little in common with other Renaissance artists, and there is something strangely modern about Bosch's works, and they still appeal to contemporary audiences. So now a little bit of fun. Earlier, we mentioned the success of the Broadway musical Six, based on the wives of Henry VIII. The show put to music the old British rhyme that is taught to school children. Of the six wives, they were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So let's look now at the artist who immortalized Henry VIII and his six wives. Hans Holbein the Younger was a painter, draftsman, and designer who came from a family of artists. Holbein was born in 1497 in Augsburg in southern Germany and trained in the studio of his father, Hans Holbein the Elder. In 1515, Holbein and his brother Ambrosius went to Basel, where they designed prints, murals, and stained glass. 2 years later, Holbein went to Lucerne with his father, where they painted murals for the mansion of the city's mayor. In 1519, following the premature death of his brother, Holbein returned to Basel, where now, by himself, he ran a busy workshop. He designed murals and altarpieces, illustrated books, and contributed to Martin Luther's translation of the Bible. And like his father, he designed stained glass windows and painted some portraits. In Praise of Folly is an essay written in Latin in 1509 by Erasmus and first printed in 1511. The book was a satirical critique of both the Catholic Church and popular superstitions and was dedicated to Erasmus's friend, the English Renaissance humanist, Sir Thomas More. The title of the work in Latin is More Encomium, which makes the affectionate joke of More's last name, as it can be translated as either the praise of folly or the praise of More. Erasmus continued the wordplay throughout the text, parodying the elaborate literary style both he and More would have encountered in their classical studies. It is considered one of the most notable works of the Renaissance and was employed as one of the catalysts in the Protestant Reformation. While he was still a teenager, Holbein drew a famous series of over 80 pen and ink illustrations in the margin of Erasmus's own copy of the book. Holbein's humorous doodles were adapted as engravings in a later edition, and they were copied for the next 200 years. From that point, Holbein enjoyed a friendship with Erasmus, one of the most famous writers of his day, and one of the most admired humanist scholars. In this portrait, Holbein has tried to surround Erasmus with items which reflect his interests and profession. Holbein's likeness gives us a truly memorable image of a Renaissance man. Erasmus is depicted in a library-like setting that includes an elegant column, and so his profession is not lost on viewers. His hands physically connect with one of the books he wrote. And note the luxurious fur and velvet robe that he wears. All of these things serve to make him look grand. Holbein made several portraits of Erasmus, whose letters of introduction in London led the young artist to many well-placed clients. Although it doesn't look small here, this very small portrait at the Met has captured the graying, lined face of the aging scholar. In 1519, shortly before he was accepted into the local artists' guild, Holbein married Elsbeth Binzenstock, a widow who was a few years older. Elsbeth was running her late husband's tanning business and had an infant son. In their first year of marriage, Holbein and Elsbeth had a son, and 6 years later, they added a daughter, and then 2 more children in later years. And this portrait shows Elsbeth with their 2 oldest children, Philip and Katharina. And note that Holbein painted on paper. Then the figures were cut out and mounted on wood. It is believed that the painting was originally larger and included another figure. Possibly it was a depiction of Holbein himself. Between 1519 and 1526, Holbein decorated buildings and painted portraits and altarpieces, including this one of the Madonna with Saint Ursus and a bishop saint. These works are characterized by their bright and often cool colors and high measure of detail. Holbein shows Italian influence in these larger compositions and in the designs and in the idealism of the characterization. The Reformation made it difficult for Holbein to support himself as an artist in Basel. The market for religious art was shrinking, and Holbein received fewer commissions. So at the age of 29, with a family, he traveled to London. Erasmus furnished him with a letter of introduction to Sir Thomas More. More was a humanist and statesman, Chancellor of England, who was beheaded later for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as head of the Church of England. He is recognized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. He was the most important patron of Holbein during his first stay in London. Holbein painted portraits of More and his family, which helped him to quickly establish an international reputation. Contemporaries marveled at his ability to capture the exact likeness of sitters and their elegant garments. In 1528, Holbein returned to Basel with money to purchase a house there for his wife and children, and 4 years later, he returned to England to resume his career there. Living continuously away from home, Holbein did not remain faithful to his wife, who would remain in Basel, but he did continue to support her. When he returned to London, Holbein received this commission for one of his most famous portraits. This painting was commissioned by Jean de Dintville on the left, the French ambassador to England, and his friend Georges de Selve on the right, who was at that time the Bishop of Lavaur and who was at different times an ambassador to the Pope, the Republic of Venice, and the Emperor. This work was meant to show the education and culture of these two men and to proclaim their status as part of the cultural and social elite. Though Holbein often included objects as symbols of his subjects, the objects represented here are so specific to the patrons that their meanings would have been very obvious to the contemporary viewer. The religious texts are allusions to the strife going on in Europe at the time, and the broken string on the lute signifies the division that was occurring during the Reformation. The globes represent the men's earthly and cosmic intelligence and education, and allude to their understanding of things in both this world and the spiritual world. However, by far the most interesting aspect of this work is the elongated anamorphic skull in the foreground. When the painting is viewed from a specific point to the right of it, the distortion is corrected and the skull is clearly seen. This distorted image represents the mortality of human beings and the shortness of life. This type of allusion to death in a painting is called vanitas. There are two reasons for King Henry VIII's persistent fame: the fascinating history of his reign and the artistic genius of Hans Holbein the Younger. Henry VIII was King of England from 1509 to 1547. He presided over the beginnings of the English Renaissance and the English Reformation. This is the quintessential portrait of Henry VIII. It is perhaps the earliest image of the king by Holbein, and it is beautifully detailed. Real gold was used for the sleeve and the king's jewelry. Yet Holbein's portrait is not flattering. Henry appears guarded and suspicious and quite unapproachable. The same year as this portrait, Holbein became exclusive court painter and fashion designer to King Henry VIII, a position he held until his death. As the royal fashion designer, he made designs for all the king's state robes, buttons and buckles, as well as designing pageant weapons. The more than 100 miniature and full-size portraits Holbein completed in the court of Henry VIII, including numerous portraits and drawings of the king and some of his wives, provide a remarkable document of that colorful period. Because Henry had portraits destroyed of the wives he discarded, we don't have all the original Holbein portraits of some of them, but instead you'll see we have some artist copies. So let's meet the wives of Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon was the first wife of the king. She had previously been married to Henry's brother Arthur, but he died within 6 months of their marriage. For some years, she and Henry lived happily. Catherine matched her husband's intellectual interests, and she was a competent regent while he was campaigning against the French. Catherine gave birth to 6 children, including 2 sons, but all except Mary who would later be queen, were either stillborn or died in infancy. Henry's desire for a legitimate male heir prompted him in 1527 to appeal to Rome for an annulment. Catherine appealed to Pope Clement VII, contending that her marriage to Henry was valid because her previous marriage to Henry's brother had never been consummated. For 7 years, the Pope avoided issuing the annulment, but Henry went ahead and separated from Catherine in July of 1531. 2 years later, 5 months after he'd already married his second wife, he had his own archbishop annul his marriage to Catherine. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, repudiating all papal jurisdiction in England and making the king head of the English Church. Although Catherine had always been loved by the English people, Henry forced her to spend her last years isolated from all public life. The refusal of Pope Clement VII to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine triggered the break between Henry and Rome and led to the English Reformation. Anne Boleyn was the king's second wife and the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. Anne's arrogant behavior made her unpopular at court. Henry lost interest in her and began liaisons with other women. Although the birth of a son might have saved the marriage, on May 2nd, 1536, Henry had her committed to the Tower of London on a charge of adultery with various men and even incest with her own brother. She was tried by a court of peers, unanimously convicted, and as I'm sure you know, beheaded on May 19th. 11 days later, Henry married his third wife. That Anne was guilty as charged is unlikely. She was apparently the victim of a temporary court faction supported by this man, Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's chief minister. Cromwell's own downfall came when he negotiated Henry's 4th marriage to the Protestant Anne of Cleves. Choosing her led to an accusation of treason, and he was beheaded in 1540. Well, no portraits of Anne Boleyn that can be definitively attributed to Holbein survive. It seems likely that any portraits that Holbein had painted of her were destroyed after she was beheaded. That Holbein worked directly for Anne and her circle is, however, clear. He designed many of the extravagant monuments and decorations for her coronation, as well as jewelry and books connected to her. He's also sketched several women attached to her entourage. So this, we believe, was a copy done after a Holbein original. Jane Seymour was the 3rd wife of Henry VIII and mother of King Edward VI. She succeeded where Henry's previous wives had failed in providing a legitimate male heir to the throne. Jane Seymour had been a lady-in-waiting to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and then to Anne Boleyn. Henry probably became attracted to Jane during his marriage to Anne, but though willing to marry him, she refused to be his mistress. That undoubtedly helped bring about Anne Boleyn's downfall and execution. Jane managed to restore Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, to the king's favor, and the future king, Edward VI, was born on October 12, 1537, but to Henry's genuine sorrow, Jane died just 12 days later. She was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral and the only queen to be buried beside him at Windsor Castle. Now, Anne of Cleves was Henry's 4th wife. He married her on the recommendation of Sir Thomas More, believing that he needed to form a political alliance with her brother William, Duke of Cleves, who was the leader of the Protestants of Western Germany. Henry thought that the 2 major Roman Catholic powers, France and the Holy Roman Empire, were about to join together to attack Protestant England. In 1539, Holbein was sent to Doran in the Duchy of Cleves to paint a portrait of Anne as a possible candidate for marriage. It seemed that in a need to exercise diplomacy and tact, Holbein placed his focus on Anne's dress. But on January 1st, 1540, Anne arrived in England to meet her fiancé for the first time. 5 days later, the wedding took place. It was a very brief marriage, to the astonishment of all observers, but to the relief of both spouses. Henry infamously referred to his bride as a, quote, fat Flanders mare, and told courtiers and ambassadors that he could not perform his husbandly duties because of Anne's appearance. Despite or because of the evident humiliation of the failed marriage, she obtained a handsome settlement from Henry and lived a quiet comfort in England until she died. The mysteries of physical attraction denied Anne her place on the throne, and, well, then thrust the king into the arms of his ill-fated fifth queen. Catherine Howard was the fifth wife of Henry VIII. Her downfall came when he learned of her premarital affairs. Henry first became attracted to her when he was seeking to end his politically motivated marriage to Anne of Cleves, to whom Catherine was a maid of honor. Immediately after his marriage to Anne was annulled, Henry and Catherine were privately married. He publicly acknowledged her as queen on August 8th, and for the next 14 months, Henry appeared to be very much in love with his bride until learning of her premarital affairs. Henry had Parliament pass a bill declaring it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king. Well, you know what happened next. 2 days later, Catherine was beheaded in the Tower of London. This miniature portrait is believed to represent Catherine Howard, but because Henry destroyed evidence of every wife he discarded, her identity can only be assumed. The most compelling argument in favor of her regal status is that the large ruby, emerald, and pearl jewel which this sitter wears is the same as that shown in Holbein's panel portrait of Henry VIII's third queen, Jane Seymour, and that this and the jeweled band around the sitter's neck line may have been given to Catherine Howard by Henry VIII at their marriage in 1540. So wearing the Queen's jewels, we assume she is Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII. Catherine Parr was the sixth and last wife of the king. She had been widowed twice before she married Henry on July 12th of 1543. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal, an official of the royal household, and was familiar with the ways of the Tudor court. She surrounded herself with wise, capable, and trustworthy advisors, and unlike every queen since Catherine of Aragon, she earned the trust of Henry. She developed close friendships with the three children Henry had by previous marriages and devoted herself to their education. By all accounts, Catherine was a patient, loving, and devoted wife to Henry in his last years of illness, disillusion, and pain. After Henry's death in January of 1547, she married again, but she died shortly after giving birth to her only child, a daughter. So we end Holbein's story with this large-scale work. It was commissioned to commemorate the grant of a royal charter to the Company of Barbers and the Guild of Surgeons on their merger in 1540. Henry did not sit for this painting. Holbein worked from an existing sketch and painted him as an icon. The painting was badly damaged in the Great Fire of London in 1666. It's not clear how much of the original panel was completed by Holbein himself, who died in the year the painting was begun, and how much by others. Neither is it known whether those who first added to the work did so under Holbein's supervision. Holbein was apparently a victim of the plague. He made his will on October 7th, 1543, and a document dated November 29th describes him as having recently died. Holbein effectively brought Renaissance painting to Britain from Europe. He stands as one of the great portraitists in art history and had a great impact on the culture of Henry VIII's court. So we're going to conclude with our final artist, Peter Bruegel the Elder, a Flemish painter and printmaker known for his landscapes and peasant scenes. The date and place of Bruegel's birth are not certain. As you've seen, that's very typical from the Northern Renaissance, although it has been placed between 1525 and 1530. Bruegel is believed to have been born near the town of Breda, in present-day Holland. He was the greatest member of a large and important family of artists active for 4 generations. The term the elder is used to distinguish him from his eldest son, Peter Bruegel the Younger, also known as Hell Bruegel for his bizarre taste in subject matter. And his younger son was Jan, who preferred painting things like flowers and was known as Velvet Bruegel. Peter Bruegel, the elder's name, was originally spelled with an H, but he dropped the H from his name in 1559 to differentiate himself from his sons, who retained the use of the H in theirs. And this is thought to be a self-portrait in which Bruegel appears to have been interrupted by a potential buyer who has his hand on his purse and examines the work in progress through his spectacles. It is a symbiotic relationship between art and commerce that is fraught with complications, one that hasn't changed noticeably since Bruegel's drawing more than 4 centuries ago. So Bruegel spent most of his life in Antwerp and Brussels. He was an apprentice of Peter Coca van Alst, an artist, sculptor, and architect, and a designer of tapestry and stained glass. Bruegel would later marry Van Alst's daughter, Maken. In 1551, Bruegel was accepted as a master in the Painters Guild. The following year, he made the customary artist journey to Italy for purposes of study. And 4 years later, Bruegel returned to Antwerp by way of the Alps, which resulted in a large number of exquisite drawings of mountain landscapes. And these sketches formed the basis for many of his later paintings. They were not records of actual places, but composites made from his notes and sketches. Bruegel's vision of the mountain is sublime, yet it's rendered in remarkable detail. The scattering of tiny human figures and buildings is seemingly included only to enhance the imposing majesty of the surrounding summits. As in all of his landscape, nature is exalted and given center stage. This pen drawing was published by Hieronymus Koch, a leading humanist print publisher in Antwerp. It is reminiscent of Bosch's works we saw earlier. It appears that Koch hired Bruegel to imitate Bosch's work. Koch might have used Bosch's name as a marketing strategy, since a Bosch print would sell more easily than something by the young and then lesser known Bruegel. And here we see a father showing his child the fish and teaching him a valuable lesson. Bruegel illustrated the proverb, big fish eat little fish, meaning that the rich get richer while the poor get poorer, a lesson that had been widely taught throughout Europe since ancient times. Bruegel's representation has generally been interpreted as an allusion to greed, yet surprisingly, the most significant detail has often been overlooked. The biggest and greediest fish lies stranded and gutted, while smaller fish spill from its entrails. In other words, all it's accumulated is now lost. The moral of the story being that greed does not pay. In 1556, Bruegel began drawing a series on the theme of the 7 deadly sins. He produced disturbing, unnatural landscapes filled with magical beings, in part playfully fantastical, in part genuinely threatening. It was presumably this mixture between these two elements, perhaps the thrill of fear, that was so sought after at the time. Greed is the first in the series. The personification of avarice is a seated woman with money in her lap. With her free hand, she reaches into a treasure chest, which is being refilled by 2 monsters from a broken jug. Her eyes are downcast, intent on the money, or she may be blind. She is certainly blind to all that is happening around her, as she is preoccupied by the money. Behind avarice is a money lender's hut. He is seen taking a plate from a poor man. Throughout the drawing, we see greed preying upon greed. Drawn by Bruegel, these images were engraved by Peter van der Heyden, an accomplished engraver, but they carry Bruegel's signature, a sign of Bruegel's increasing importance. So this is Bruegel's earliest signed and dated painting. The influence of Bosch is still felt, however, a new sensitivity to color, particularly in the use of bright primary hues and a rhythmic organization of forms, is uniquely Bruegel's. The fight between Carnival and Lent depicts a festival held in the southern Netherlands. This 3-day festival of frantic eating, drinking, and carousing that preceded the 40 days of Lent was one of a number of popular celebrations co-opted by the church and made official as part of the pre-Lenten ritual. Bruegel's painting offered a satirical critique on the conflicts of the Reformation. The fact that the church had to allow carnival in order to enforce Lent was a source of tension between the church officials and the people. Bruegel's panorama of 16th century life contains 200 individual figures and is amazing in its minute detail. Bruegel used a high-angle viewpoint, shunning the central perspective so dear to the Italians. On the left side of the painting, there is an inn, and on the right side of their painting, it is a church. The juxtaposition is meant to illustrate the two sides of human nature, pleasure and religious chastity, and the contrast between the two. Near the church sit well-behaved children. Near the inn are rambunctious drunkards. At the center, Bruegel stresses the opposition between the traditional enemies, Carnival and Lent, by representing their conflict as a joust. Representing Carnival's excesses is a brightly dressed, obese man sitting atop a huge beer barrel, ready to joust with Lent, a skinny creature dressed in mourning and seated on an uncomfortable prayer stool. Carnival holds a cooking spit full of holiday meat, while Lent weekly holds out a baker's paddle holding 2 herring. In the 16th century, the biblical tale of man's disastrous attempt to reach heaven was a favorite theme. King Nimrod ordered a tower to be built that would reach the clouds. God punished him by making the workers speak in a babel of tongues. The result was, of course, complete and utter chaos. In the biblical version, the tower was built in Babylon, but Bruegel has set his tower outside a busy Flemish city. The tower sits with life and stirs with life and is so enormous that even uncompleted, it dwarfs the men and the landscape around it. Men are hard at work on every level of the tower while the king idly looks on. In many ways, this was the daily life of the peasants that Bruegel was so fond of painting. They had no choice but to work their fingers to the bone and ultimately very little chance of ever rising above their stations. One can imagine when looking at the painting just how many years these men have been building this tower, which is ultimately doomed to fail. It is nonetheless a magnificent and awe-inspiring painting. In 1563, Bruegel left Antwerp. He married Mayken Coca, his former teacher's daughter, and moved to Brussels. Bruegel had first met Mayken when she was a young girl, and he was apprenticed to her father. A year later, their first son, Peter Bruegel the Younger, was born. In 1564, under the spell of Italian Renaissance art, and especially of Raphael, Bruegel reduces the number of figures in his paintings drastically. The few he used were larger and placed closer together in a very narrow space. Now, typically in a nativity scene, the onlookers are focused on the child, and here most of the onlookers are looking in different directions, at each other, or at the astonishing gifts, or at the even more astonishing presence of the 3 elongated, colorfully dressed strangers. These 3 kings presenting their gifts are treated as caricatures, and the Virgin is not idealized. Of note is a figure on the extreme right who wears spectacles. His presence may indicate that those around him are blind to Christ's significance. Bruegel has used spectacles on other occasions to signify, in an ironic manner, the inability of the subject to see the truth. Bruegel's inclusion of soldiers may have been done to reflect the Spanish occupation of the Netherlands at the time. And note Bruegel's use of the color red to move your eye around the canvas, from the jacket on the left, up and around to the strange red pointed boot worn by the Black King on the right. In 1565, Bruegel was commissioned to paint a series based on the medieval idea of the labors of the season. The series included 6 works, 5 of which survive. The central theme of the series is that man, if he follows the order of nature, can avoid the folly for which he is otherwise destined. The role of mankind is portrayed by peasants, anonymous symbols of humanity, who live and work close to the soil in a state of unity with nature. The figures are shown very small with the focus on the landscapes, and the Met in New York City is fortunate to have the harvesters in their collection. It is believed to represent the months of August and September. It shows a ripe field of wheat that has been partially cut and stacked. In the foreground, a number of peasants pause to picnic in the shade of a pear tree, While work continues around them in the background, the vastness of the panorama shows that Bruegel's emphasis is not on the labors that mark the time of the year, but on the atmosphere and transformation of the landscape itself. Bruegel would often take a friend to go with him on trips among the peasants, basically crashing their fairs and weddings. They would dress like peasants and act as if they belonged to the families in attendance or acquaintances of the bride or groom. They even went so far as to bring presents like other guests. Because of his peasant scenes, Bruegel was often referred to as Peasant Bruegel. It's often difficult to know where to begin when viewing a Bruegel work. His paintings are like a Where's Waldo, with Bruegel's subject matter usually hidden among crowds of people or activity. Viewers have to wade through the distractions to find the subject. The wedding feast has taken place in a barn. The bride sits in front of a piece of green cloth with a kind of crown suspended over her head. She sits quietly with folded hands and a content grin on her face. The older man in the chair and the woman beside her are probably her parents. Debate continues about the identity and whereabouts of the bridegroom. The bridegroom may be in the foreground, neatly dressed in black, calling for more wine. Alternatively, taking into account the fact that traditionally the groom was expected to serve the bride and her family, he might be the modest young man who takes dishes from the door carried by the two burly servants. Or maybe he is the man refilling the wine jugs in the left foreground. And it's possible that he could be this man, tucked away, just busy eating with his spoon. Like that man, most of the people at the table concentrate on eating and drinking, but much more is going on. There is the crowd in the background trying to get in. There are the musicians, and there's a child in the foreground who has got hold of a plate and is completely absorbed in the food, a picture of innocent greed. But look at the way in which Bruegel has organized his painting so that it does not look crowded or confusing. The placement of people was well planned and creates vignettes of activity which moves the viewer's eye around this work. This panel was painted about the same time as the peasant wedding. They may have been intended as a pair or part of a series illustrating peasant life. And here we see a dance at a fair, which is being held in the village square outside an inn. The large couple in the foreground appears to be hurrying to the dance, while further back we see two other couples already dancing. If we look at the house with the banner to the left side of the background, we can see a man trying to coax a reluctant woman out to dance. This is not just a humorous picture recording village life. Bruegel has put a moral slant on what we observe. Gluttony, lust, and anger can all be seen in this painting. Bruegel draws our attention to the fact that although this is a saint's day, he has depicted the dancers having turned their backs on the church, and they take little notice of the picture of the Virgin, which hangs from the tree. Bruegel's painting is still making its mark today. Created in 2004, the label for Bruegel Amber Ale features the two men on the left. The magpie on the gallows may reflect the invasion of Brussels by the Spanish, who between 1567 and 1569 slaughtered thousands of men, women, and children. It is a haunting representation of human suffering set within the grander scheme of human endurance. Peasants dance, sing, laugh, and carouse in the shadow of the gallows that have temporarily become the roost for a harmless magpie. Like the bird, the peasants are greedy for life and hardy and industrious, even in the face of death. The gallows are a stark reminder of the violence of the age, while the dancing people are symbolic of human indifference as well as human survival. This painting is thought to be the last one of Bruegel's late works because done just before his death. Perhaps it was his final work. On his deathbed, he asked his wife to burn drawings that might get her in trouble with religious authorities who found his tolerant ideas dangerous. But he told her to keep the magpie on the gallows for herself. Bruegel died in Brussels on September 9th, 1569, and he was about 44 years old. Bruegel's art captured life in 16th century Netherlands. He was considered the first Western painter who painted landscapes outside a religious context. Bruegel's reputation suffered an eclipse from the middle of the 17th century until his rediscovery in the later part of the 19th century, and he is now recognized as a major Netherlandish master of the 16th century and one of the most innovative painters in the history of art. So I thank you for joining us. If you would like a list of where some of the works featured in our lecture can be found within driving distance, please email us at info@artscapades.com. And remember to include which lecture you're looking for. This one is Northern Renaissance. And we will be back on Wednesday, June 5th, with a lecture that brings us a little bit closer to home and a slight bit more contemporary. And we're going to be looking at some of the Connecticut art colonies, and specifically the artists of Cascab, Lime, and Silvermine. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if you have any questions or comments. So did we leave everyone, the Northern Renaissance, I think, just is so overwhelming and leaves us a little bit speechless, but did you know any of the artists?
Mhm. Yeah.
And has anybody seen the musical Six? Did you know this story of divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived? I didn't know that was a rhyme they taught children in England so they would know who the wives were.
Jody, can you hear me?
I can hear, yes.
Is the lecture on June 5th going to be virtual, or is there a location?
We're continuing on Zoom, right,
On
Cindy?
Zoom. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
No, this is very interesting.
So good. Well, thank you. Again, it's good to see everyone over the Zoom too. Again, you can always check our website to see what other lectures we're giving in other places, and we will be doing some in-person ones as well. But Zoom is great for everybody who can join us that way too. So we try to do them both. It works out well. I think we're still trying to figure out how to master the hybrid, and nobody's quite done it yet.
Well, it's hard to do with something like this, which is so visual.
I know, I think it was, we were going to go to one library where they had some sort of new system they put in, and they were going to be able to Zoom, have us live in the library and Zoom us out to homes, but it didn't work the way they expected. So they asked us to stay home, and they Zoomed us not only to people's homes, but they Zoomed us into the library on a giant screen. So some people came in there, but it was fun for us because where we see each other like this face, each individual faces, there was one square where I could see people, what they were drinking, looked like they were having wine and cookies to me. So a group of people got together that way.
Hmm.
So.
May I have your attention?
Thank you.
please?
Thank you very
you.
much, Jody.
Sure. Did you want to, somebody, I think it's Pat, were you trying to say something?
Library computers will shut off automatically in about 7 minutes. So if you are working on something, please make.
Okay, I'm not sure what that was, but
Jody, thank you very much. 3 pages of notes. I'm still trying to digest what you said.
well, thank you. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Wonderful presentation. Yeah, for us in Virginia, that's really worthwhile. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, I know I'm zooming in from Florida, so for me this works out well, but I'm heading back up north soon, so it's good. But it's nice to see everyone, and glad you could join us. And I think the next lecture is going to be a lot of fun as we look at some local art, which will be great to talk about something on this continent again.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yep.
so thanks so much, and everybody continue to
See
stay
you all
well.
in June.
Yeah, we'll see you. Yeah, we're just a month away, so we'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Cindy.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Cindy. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.